you have, you have given a critique of contemporary activism, and you mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I think the way you kind of put it is, you said, a lot of people, they're just struggling so much that they don't really have the bandwidth to turn and listen to the activists. But you also really highlight the importance of, kind of a re-education on a lot of different issues. So what's kind of a better activist approach then?
Okay. That's a big topic because it's going to have to be a combination of things. See, I look at it in multiple tiers. So I don't put people down for, causing, making noise in the street with signs and the general protest. I think what we aren't seeing anymore, which was very successful in the 1960s civil rights movement, is true civil disobedience. We see pockets of anger, such as the unbelievable, riots and so on that happen due to police brutality. But it's not strategic, of course. So you have that level, and I think that's fine, but that's sort of like the beginning level. The true form of activism, as I see it, is literally a design think tank project that gets people together to first accept the fact that we have to change the underlying structure of our society. And again, not falling back onto communism and socialism and all of those esoteric myths ultimately in people's minds. No one can even define those terms if you really question them about it. But to do something that actually engineers true change from the ground up. And the way I see it ultimately occurring, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I don't believe that there is going to be a top-down regulatory change on this planet. I think these power systems are so corrupted that by the time they realize what they really have to do in terms of stopping a market economy, for example, that's based on infinite growth, and this terrible hierarchical system of inequality, which creates more and more discord between the species, by the time they realize that, it's going to be far too late. So I encourage people, and again, I'm jumping way ahead, because I'm going to talk about this on my podcast, to start developing new systems internally. So to create a revolution within the system using advanced technologies that can supersede, that can override the general infrastructure that we come to be, fundamentally starting to get rid of the use of money in internal communities through many different avenues, networks of time banks. You have all sorts of sharing systems, tool libraries, supporting people to go out and actually create agricultural projects with advanced technology, not just lo-fi, planting seeds in some community garden, but getting investment to localize communities where people start to just get off the grid. Just like your house can be off the grid, you don't have to worry about utility bills and so on. This is what communities need to start doing, and actively so. And I think if that spreads, the logic will happen. Eventually you'll get a country to get off the grid that will actually use sustainability principles and the protocols that I speak of at length in my book. That is the way I see real activism developing. Stop yelling, stop telling the politicians what to do, stop complaining. It's not going to go anywhere. You'll knock out a few things here and there. You might get some legislation to help this and that, but the system is it's like a big river, and it's all political economy is a market-based reality. The politicians are fundamentally bought, even if they don't know it, because of the condition that they find themselves. It doesn't matter what they say, just the fact that they're in this reality. And the United States, of course, is the pinnacle of it. We are the ultimate example of everything that could possibly go wrong with the value systems inherent to fundamentally capitalism, to the market system of economics, to the pursuit of growth and expansion, the proxy reality of profit versus intent. Think about this. We don't do things because of intent. We don't want to solve problems directly. We think, oh, I'm going to have to make something to make money. And then if it has a positive effect on society, well, good. That's great. That's the way our entire problem solving mechanism is. It's insane. So again, I'm rambling on here, but that kind of summarizes my position on activism. I support all levels. You can lobby, you can do the protests, but until you begin to join a community and design and start to build new systems that transcend the current one, I think we're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. As ambitious as that sounds, by the way. And I'll add one more thing. If I do end up making the trilogy to this film, that's precisely what the communities do as this trilogy advances and into reflections. But I won't go into all of that.
So a couple things. Do you think that, getting to what you said, where it's like, yeah, the politicians, they don't even know that they're bought because they're participating in this, in the realm in which they find themselves. Do you think that there's kind of a stigma in the United States in particular? I would say it's worldwide too, but really in the United States in particular, where we don't recognize systemic problems as such.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that gets to the heart of a certain psychological inhibition. If you look at the whole of the evolution of knowledge, the science of epistemology, we have moved from deeply superstitious views, of course, to, by the time of the Enlightenment, at least a semblance of understanding of the scientific nature of causality. But it's still very, very counterintuitive. Everything that we see and feel, very often, very rarely do people have intuitions that are deeply acute, but it's always wrong. Everything we see is wrong. What we perceive with our five senses is simply not the way the world actually is. And when we look at causality, I debate libertarians all the time, and they have this idea of coercion and violence. So they say, oh, well, no one's putting a gun to your head to make you buy something. Why do you think the system of market economics is violent? Well, because people are actually structurally, broader speaking, in a systemic sense, put into a position of servitude by the structure. This kind of servitude exists in the coercion of the structure. And they can't conceive of that because it's just too wide for their lack of education. No one teaches this stuff in school, and the most deeply inhibited area is politics and the basic human dynamic, the human condition. Excuse me, the day-to-day reality. We can see the science of causality and the ecosystem. We understand the hydrological cycles and all those things that we understand. We understand things are linked and all that. But when it comes to the human condition, people just blinker out. They can't handle it. And I think that's a fundamental inhibition, not only in our intuition, but also the way we think. We think categorically. I mean, everything that comes out of my mouth are words. Words are categories. They're boxes of other ideas. Someone used the word like capitalism. Like, well, that is an enormous word. Like, how do you break that word down to understand what it really means? Meaning that we're categorically locked. And you have to really stop and really educate yourself on systems science, which is, I guess, the fundamental, discipline here. All science is systems based. I mean, if anything that deals with scientific causality has a system element, meaning that you have to understand interconnecting overlapping aspects. And this is all needless to say. I'm sure people think this is kind of redundant, but if you really dig deep in all the policies, the legal policies have no regard for this. When they arrest somebody for something, they look at it as a completely individualistic free will thing. But if you take a longitudinal approach, longitudinal studies that look at crime statistics in different regions with different preconditions where people exist, like inner cities that are poor, you see a distribution of this crime that's very, very consistent. So therefore, it can't be just free will volition. There's something else happening. So people have a very hard time with that. So that's the fundamental cognitive inhibition. And then you have just the fundamental traditions that people get locked into in their comfort zones. Religion, I always have tolerance for religious belief. I mean, it's just still pretty much insane that people still. I mean, we have a person that's being nominated to the Supreme Court.
I feel like you might have made a movie about this before.
Yeah, we have a person literally that's considered a high intellectual mind that's supposed to make amazing judgments about the future of American civil law. And she is an insane religious fanatic and basically a cult subsect of Catholicism. Her belief system. I mean, how can you think about how bizarre that is? That our intellectual integrity in this country in the Supreme Court is revolving around these people that literally believe in things that can absolutely not be proved with no reason, logic, or whatsoever. So anyway, that's a traditional inhibition that once again feeds into this free will notion. So going back to the crime issue. That's a great example. It's probably the best example. And I pretty much forgot what your other question was. So can you remind me?
Well, we were talking about how people don't identify,
Right.
systemic problems as such, which I do think it's a theme we really need to come around to. And I can bring up so many micro examples, just that I inherit in my daily life, where it's like, hey, Ron, you talk about the corporate media and how it's not a good thing. I have a buddy who works for CNN doing XYZ. I'm sure you'd get along with them. And it's like that's not the point.
Right.
We're talking about a structural problem. One of the most common cliches people throw out there, like, well, not all cops are bad.
Right.
That's not the point. It's a structural problem. It's a structural problem. And politicians, like, well, I like so-and-so in district whatever. Yeah, but it's a structural problem. And even if they have well intentions, they're probably going to be redistricted at the end of the day. Actually, that's usually how it works.
Yeah, right. Look at the, of course, systemic racism. I mean, this word has now been thrown around by so many people for the past year, and with good reason. I'm glad to hear people say it, but almost no one knows what they're saying. I mean, they don't know what systemic racism actually means. It's this overlapping historical unfolding that's happened since the slavery period in America, where this step-by-step process of cultural shifts and then incentives. And as Martin Luther King pointed out, just to go into this to a little bit of detail, after the Civil War, that's when the racism really, really began, because the free, poor Black people are now in direct economic competition with the existing poor white people in the South. And if you look at trends across the country, or excuse me, across the world, in Italy or any of these nations, or Ukraine versus Russia, if you interview and see the polls on this, everyone hates each other due to economic reasons. In Virginia, for example, because I'm from North Carolina and I knew people in Virginia. And believe it or not, before NAFTA, where people from Mexico and Latin America started to come to the United States, everyone in lower West Virginia hated everyone from northern West Virginia because they were taking all the jobs. So you see this pattern throughout. And this is unfortunately the most deep-rooted element of systemic racism. It's rooted in economic fear. But it's not immediate economic fear. It's a culturally developed pattern from that fear over the course of many generations. And suddenly people have forgotten why they're even racist. And it becomes, takes on a life of its own. So that's a little bit on that subject. But again, as you point out, this is a huge lapse in our educational system, huge lapse. And I think, frankly, people see it as very unromantic. They think, well, if this is true, if there is causality on this level, again, I must not be as free in my own volition. And there's nothing wrong with understanding that you are stuck in a kind of position of causality where, yeah, you have some degree of free will, but yeah, you are also deeply influenced by what has happened in your childhood, by what goes on around you, and of course, by the structure of the society and what it incentivizes. So let's jump back again to systemic change. Mm-hmm.
Do you think a general strike would help?
Yeah, I've always encouraged a huge mass strike against the system, particularly the economic attributes that are the most detrimental. But the thing is, the fear of people losing their reputation and everything that goes along with being a proactive activist gets in the way. The system is very much locking people in. It's a little bit rare right now that we're seeing so many protests. It's because of COVID, because people are actually unemployed. You would not see so many people hitting the streets for all these causes if it wasn't for that fact. They would be, just locked into their bubbles. The system kind of has everybody by the balls, so to speak. Everyone is structurally limited. The lower and poor, the middle class and the poor naturally have the most to fight for, but they're also the ones that are so in debt. They're also the most structurally oppressed. They can barely think past, feeding their family and taking care of themselves and trying to be healthy. So I've always been in favor of mass strikes. That would be a good wake up. But here's the difference. If people don't know what they want after the strike, then what's the point? Look at all the energy spent on the police protests. Nobody really put forward a policy that described what to do. Defund the police is the most vague thing that you could put out there, and of course has been completely turned upside down, and people completely misinterpret what was meant by that. Yeah, you should demilitarize the police. There's a great policy, but that hasn't happened. There's just there has to be something a little more concrete. And what I hope to do, in the best I can, I'm working on a kind of a white paper, a peer review style paper that takes a sociological view of social change. And I'll be talking about this on my podcast, and hopefully inspire people to come together and work on an actual change project that isn't just anger, it isn't just protest, but literally a step-by-step kind of recipe to get more people on board with what's required. I think you can have rapid change in this society, but everyone has to be on the same page, and no one is on the same page. And you can pretty much blame the ridiculous pluralism in our political lunacy for that, again, coupled with the fact that people just aren't educated on any of these issues.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your